the new Maritime Doctrine of the United States of America. How Washington abolished 40 years of pretense and established a new maritime order in just 3 days. Over 3 days in April, the American fleet did what had been expected of it since 1979. It moved from rhetoric to action. 2 seized tankers, one in the Gulf of Oman, the other in the Indian Ocean, mean the end of an era in which terrorist regimes financed their wars without hindrance, while Western experts discuss the complexity and ambiguity of the situation. The era of pretense, I would say, is over. The era of consequences is beginning. Pay the bills. Or, as they used to say back in my days in Russia, you'll have to answer for your words. Another important story is unfolding in Lebanon. Today it sounds like science fiction, but back in the 1960s. In the 1960s, Lebanon was one of the most prosperous countries in the Middle East. Beirut was called the Paris of the Middle East. This wasn't just out of politeness, but because it was a real center of banking, education, publishing, and fashion. And of course, tourism as well. There were ski resorts in the mountains and casinos and theaters on the coast. In the universities, they taught in 3 languages. I'll talk about that as well. And one more thing. 78 years ago, a handful of Jews who survived the catastrophe, surrounded by 7 Arab armies, without allies, without weapons, declared themselves a state, Israel. Back then, the world gave them 3 weeks to exist. But let's start with the fact that the U.S. has once again become the world's policeman. April 19th, an American destroyer, Spruance, named after Admiral Raymond Spruance, intercepted the Iranian cargo ship Tuzka in the Gulf of Oman. 6 hours of warnings, 0 response. A shell hit the engine room and immediately there was a reaction, instant. With Marines on deck and without any shots fired or resistance, everyone started doing as they were told. The vessel is under American sanctions for transporting Iranian oil. The route is from Zhuhai, China to Bandar Abbas. It was carrying components for the Iranian missile program. No more, no less. Everything is transparent. Chinese infrastructure is working for the Iranian regime. On the night of April 25th, the oil tanker Tiffany, with a displacement of about 300,000 tons, was loaded and seized already in the Indian Ocean. A hell-born assault. The video was published by the Pentagon, an operation, again without a single shot fired. The tanker was formally sailing under the flag of Botswana, but in fact it was without a flag, a typical Shadow Fleet vessel, registered in Mumbai. It took on Iranian oil at sea twice, via ship-to-ship transfers with sanctioned vessels. The real recipient, of course, is China. Trump called it sarcastically a gift from China, and he makes no attempt to hide the irony. 300,000 barrels of oil. Together, it's less. Still, it's an addition to the American strategic reserve. Thank you very much, comrades from China. These are not 2 separate operations. This is a bid for a new reality, one that the whole world will now have to reckon with. That's why so-called international law is silent, and why it doesn't matter. They tell us Indian oil is not contraband. From the point of view of international law, formally, that's correct. Absolutely formally correct. Iran has the right to sell oil. China has the absolute right to buy it. And Indian companies have every right to transport it. But let's call things by their proper names. This right means the right of the regime, which has been chanting death to America for 40 years, to earn $500 million a day, and then use that money to pay the Houthis, who are sinking Greek bulk carriers in the Red Sea, the right to finance Hamas, to wipe out Israelis, to build an atomic bomb. If this is international law, then it's built in such a way that it protects murderers and ties the hands of defenders. It seems to me that such a law should either be rewritten or it should stop being taken seriously. Washington has finally chosen the second option. That was the right decision. The UN is completely blocked. It's a useless organization. This is a verdict on the UN, not on America. The only body formally capable of sanctioning such actions by agreement of the whole world is the UN Security Council. But in it, Moscow and Beijing have veto power. That means any decision against Iran is automatically blocked by two states that themselves profit from Iran's trade in death. What does that mean? That the UN, from what was once a lofty idea, I don't know if it was ever really a lofty idea or not, but there was something like, let's replace the League of Nations with a mechanism that actually works. But it turned into another mechanism for protecting terrorist regimes, into an organization where a country waging a war of aggression in Europe and a country preparing to invade Taiwan have the right to forbid the rest of the world from defending itself. They veto our right to defend ourselves. Who in this situation is violating the international order? America, which is taking action, or the UN, which is deliberately paralyzed? The answer is obvious, in my opinion. That's why the US is doing the right thing. It's right, not even looking toward the UN. They put their representative there to talk and don't pay any more attention to him. The UN General Assembly, just to be clear, from then until 2024, over a period of 10 years, 240 resolutions have been adopted. 71 against all the countries of the world, and 173 against Israel. Once again, just to be clear, 173 resolutions in 10 years against Israel, and 71 against all other countries combined, the UN Human Rights Council. Since its creation in 2006, let's say, up to 2024, I have the statistics. 108 resolutions against Israel. Well, probably 500 against Russia. 700, nothing like that. 45 against Syria. 15 against Iran. 10 against Russia. 4 against Venezuela. And that's it. The World Health Organization adopts one resolution every year. By countries, in general, for all countries, actually. Do you know against whom? Every year. Against Israel, against other countries. Never, not a single one. The International Labor Organization, ILO, publishes one report every year on the situation in the world. And the entire report is dedicated to Israel. It's against Israel, not a single one against others. Never. In a quarter of a century, the UN has adopted hundreds of resolutions against the only democracy in the Middle East. Meanwhile, 3 million people have died in Congo. In Ethiopia, 600,000. In Syria, 600,000. In Mexico, I think, 450,000. In Yemen, 375,000. In Darfur, 400,000. And in China, millions of Uyghurs, mostly Muslims. That's the total for these conflicts. About 6 million dead and tens of millions displaced. I'm not even talking about the fact that in Ukraine, well, that's, let's say, about another 1 million people have died in the last 4 years. It's a mechanism for legitimizing regimes that want to kill freely while all the attention is focused on a single country. It's like the left hand distracting everyone by yelling, "Catch the thieves," while they're actually committing banditry, robbery, theft, and murder themselves. The outraged world carefully looks away from it. From what they should actually be outraged about. So what are they outraged about? They're upset that Jews can no longer be targeted by pogroms, which used to be allowed but are now prohibited. They're angry that Jews are fighting back. They're outraged that the Jewish mind turns out to work well not only in chess and playing the violin, but also in creating and using modern weaponry, and this is something the world cannot tolerate. That's why they support everyone who wants to drown Israel in blood, who wants to wipe out all Jews, all Israelis, all Hebrews, all Jews, and forgive me, even kikes, from the river to the sea. And they tell us this isn't anti-Semitism. No, of course not. Anti-Semitism was in Germany, but here it's anti-Zionism. We don't want to wipe out all Jews. We only want to wipe out those Jews who want to live in Israel. Isn't that what Zionism is? Zionism means a Jew's desire to return to their homeland, to Mount Zion, Zionism. You could also call it Jewishness, the desire of a Jew to be a Jew. Or, as Ukrainian anti-Semites explain to us, the Fourth Jew Reich. That's us. Me included, Who do the sanctions support, and why is that not the main thing? Formally, 35 to 40 countries comply with American sanctions against Iran. The remaining roughly 150 states, out of fewer than 200 in total, are either indifferent or actively sabotaging. But there is a detail that people like to overlook. Those 35 to 40 countries are practically the entire economically productive world. The USA, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, all European countries, South Korea, Japan. Most countries in the world do not support sanctions in the same way that most states in the UN Hall do not support the existence of Israel. The majority is just the number of flags that are hung, but the real weight is behind those who impose these sanctions and can enforce them. China doesn't support it? Fine. But Chinese banks close Iranian clients' accounts in record time as soon as they receive a notice from the U.S. Department of the Treasury. India maintains autonomy in its judgments. Absolutely fine. But the Indian company that owns Sifani is already looking for a way to distance itself from this tanker. That's what real power is. Unlike the rhetorical flags people wave around, it's like a brick to the face for everyone who looked the other way. And I really support this. I'm very glad, thank God, that such an opportunity exists. Now then, the new naval doctrine has 4 points, in my opinion. 2 seizures in 3 days is not a coincidence and not improvisation. This is a doctrine that I think can be formulated quite briefly. First, American sanctions will be physically enforced in any part of the world's oceans. I really want you to remember this. American sanctions will be physically enforced in any part of the world's oceans, not just the Strait of Hormuz, not just the Gulf, not just the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, everywhere. Everywhere. Wherever the U.S. has a fleet. And where does the U.S. have a fleet? The U.S. has a fleet everywhere. Second, shadow fleet. You're already dead, even though you don't know it yet. Changing flags, turning off transponders, transferring cargo at sea, shell companies. None of that protects you anymore. Intelligence sees everything. From above, below, the sides, from within. The capture of Tiffany thousands of miles from Iran is proof of that. Third, the owner's nationality is poverty. India, which used to count on strategic autonomy, will now have to make a choice. Either its companies leave the Iranian route, or their tankers will be seized one by one. We guarantee them that. And fourth, and most importantly, gentlemen, they're carrying something that can be sold. It's called oil. The Venezuelan precedent showed that the American Treasury receives direct income from these operations. The blockade is no longer costly. They say, how much did you spend on it? Nothing at all. And what, did you maybe even make some money on it? Yeah, a little bit. That actually changes everything. You can keep up that kind of policy forever. That's a brilliant move by the Trump administration. Iran is trapped. Iran's lost revenue is $400 to $500 million a day. $400 to $500 million a day. Not per month and not per year. That's $500 million. 923 million people live off this. 90% of Iran's exports are oil. So 230 loaded tankers are trapped in the Persian Gulf like sardines in a can. The regime, which for 40 years built an empire of terror with oil money, for the first time found itself in a situation where this money simply isn't coming in. And it can't do anything about it. Iran's military machine is broken. 2 months of war. Israel and America. The elite forces have been wiped out. The Navy is limited. The nuclear program has been set back by years. All sorts of proxies, Sunnis, Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, have been cut off from supplies. Tehran is publicly threatening a decisive response. Well, now it's going to take a sledgehammer and wave it over its head. Then it'll throw it at the helicopter. In reality, he can't do anything because the only symmetrical response, to attack American ships, means only one thing: instant destruction of those who attack. This is the strategy of strangulation, not an assault, not an invasion. Financial and logistical strangulation of the regime until it is completely unable to pay for and wage war. Forecast. Within 68 weeks, Iran will face a choice: to surrender on American terms or watch its own oil infrastructure deteriorate from idleness. Storage facilities are full, as I've mentioned. The pumping stations will shut down. Production will have to be frozen, and Iranian wells take years to recover after being shut down. This isn't a new well. This is a well that has been operating for many years. Now we're moving on to an even more important matter: the long-awaited blow to China. China was buying Iranian oil at 20 to 30% below market price. Why? There was no one else to sell it to. We banned them from selling. Only India and China were buying from Iran. These were hidden subsidies for Chinese industry, tens of billions of dollars a year. It was thanks to this cheap fuel that Chinese goods were winning in global markets, and now the gravy train is coming to an end. Beijing is now forced to buy on the market from the Saudis and the Emirates at market price. The cost of Chinese exports has started to rise at the same time as the trade war, which is already putting pressure on the Chinese economy. Xi Jinping personally called the Saudi crown prince, demanding free passage through Hormuz. The Saudis' reaction was polite silence. Riyadh understands perfectly well that Iranian oil is a competitor to Saudi oil. The less Iranian oil on the market, the higher the price and the higher the kingdom's revenues. So, are they going to do someone a favor? China lost this round before it even started. The only reason is the unwillingness to fight directly for Iranian oil. Beijing, as always, talks loudly and quietly backs down. The world's reaction is predictably insignificant. Europe is officially maintaining a stern silence. Well, unofficially, there's some concern. Well, what do you call that? They didn't exactly panic. No action taken. The EU itself imposed sanctions against Iran in February, so they can't publicly protest. Privately, they're unhappy about the precedent, but no one in Brussels wants to challenge Washington over Iranian oil. Not enough to refuse help or actively interfere. China gives its opinion but takes zero practical steps. Maximum rhetoric, minimum risk. They don't like to take risks. They dislike being in situations where they must find a way out. Russia. Well, naturally, there's a propaganda frenzy. Moscow has no real leverage in the Indian Ocean. None at all. Absolutely none. It lost its own fleet back in Soviet times, and the Pacific Fleet has degraded to the level of, well, just a coast guard. All the Kremlin can do is shout about American piracy, while tankers in the Caribbean Sea are being seized by those very Americans one after another. New Delhi, India. India has found itself in a very uncomfortable position. They are the owners of Tiffany, an Indian company. They will have to choose either a strategic partnership with the U.S. or cheap Iranian oil. Either or. Considering the Chinese threat from the north, China is not an easy neighbor. India will almost certainly choose friendship with the U.S. after all, or rather, not to quarrel with the U.S. Indian companies will quietly start leaving Iranian routes, and Iran itself. Threats, and that's all. Ayatollah shouts, "The fleet is silent." That's a good phrase. Ayatollah shouts, "The fleet is silent." I think that's the diagnosis of the current state of the Great Persian Shah Dam. I don't know what it's called now. What does this mean in the long run? Let's think about it. Something much more important has happened than just two seized tankers. America has returned to a role it has been hiding from for 40 years. The role of the only power capable and willing to physically enforce the rules of the free world. This means the end of an era in which terrorist regimes could feed off global trade, hiding behind international law. This means that the concept of a neutral power no longer works as a safe haven for those who finance the killing of Americans and our allies, just so you know, ladies and gentlemen. This means that America is once again acting like a great power, not as the administrator of a debating club. And yes, it's uncomfortable. And for Beijing, Tehran, and Moscow, that's exactly why it's the right thing to do. Well, let's sum things up, shall we? Two tankers are a symbol. The real event is that Washington will finally stop asking permission from states that have used international institutions for decades to protect their own crimes. The new maritime order will be established not by resolutions, sorry to say that, but by destroyers. These are different ways of imposing resolutions. Not by consultations, but by landings from helicopters. Not by multipolarity, but by American superiority. Openly and without embarrassment for the first time in ages. Before, we sat on our hands for far too long. Now it works differently, and that's good. And I really hope that Trump's plan to step away from the role of world policeman works out. Because first we need to calm everyone down and then start creating regional centers that would defend themselves. Okay, now on to Lebanon and Israel, ladies and gentlemen. A forgotten history, a harsh reality, a window of opportunity. Lebanon before the Islamists was a country that could have become a bridge. Lebanon was established in 1943 as a state with a Christian majority. It was specifically created with a Christian majority, mostly Maronites. The National Pact established the distribution of power. The president is a Christian, the prime minister is a Sunni, and the speaker of parliament is a Shia. In other words, they didn't do it any other way. That's how it always was, everything together. This formula worked for decades and made Lebanon unique, an Arab country where Christians were not a minority struggling to survive, but co-creators of the state. Relations with Israel were complicated, but not like those of the other neighbors. Lebanon formally participated in the 1948 war, but its army was hardly involved in the fighting. Since 1949, a ceasefire agreement had been in effect, and the border was the quietest on the entire front of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so, between Israel and the Maronite communities, who mostly lived in the south, there was trade. There was agricultural cooperation and cultural exchange. The Christians of Lebanon, especially the Maronites, did not see Israel as an enemy, but as a natural partner in a region where both were minorities among Muslims, Sunnis, and Shiites. In 1983, an agreement was signed. Essentially, it was a peace treaty between Israel and Lebanon. It provided for normalization of relations, trade, and diplomacy. It was an absolutely realistic step by two neighboring peoples toward a shared future. The agreement did not come into force. Syria, under pressure from Moscow and with the help of the newly proclaimed Iranian Revolution, mobilized all its forces to disrupt it. The Lebanese government, under pressure, annulled it in 1984. The bridge collapsed before it could be completed. The Lebanese catastrophe did not start with Israel. It began with two imports, a Palestinian one and an Iranian one. The first import was the organization PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. After King Hussein of Jordan, in Black September of 1970, expelled Arafat and his militants from his country, they moved to Lebanon. Southern Lebanon turned into Fatahland, a state within a state where the PLO created its own camps, its own army, and its own tax system. From there, the shelling of northern Israel began. This is what forced Israel to enter Lebanon in 1978 and again in 1982. I mention this because I was already in the army then. I wasn't even in the army anymore, just at reserve training. It's called Miluim. Not to capture the country, but to eliminate the threat of shelling peaceful cities. The second import is the Communist Revolution. After 1979, Tehran began exporting the revolution. Many started it there. The Soviet Union did it, of course. Cuba did it too, and so did Iran. And on Lebanese Shiite soil, an artificial project was created, which was called Hezbollah. Money, weapons, instructors, ideology, all came from Iran. Hezbollah was not an organic product of Lebanese society. It is an Iranian prosthesis that was hastily attached to the Lebanese body. The civil war from 1975 to the 1990s completely destroyed the country the world once knew. The Christian majority emigrated to Europe, the US, Latin America, and some to Israel. The demographics shifted in favor of the Shiites. Hezbollah gradually became stronger than the Lebanese army. Lebanon effectively ceased to be a sovereign state. An Iranian proxy organization operated on its territory, conducting its own foreign policy. Well, their entire policy was war with Israel. It's important to note that Lebanon did not choose to be Israel's enemy. It was imposed on them from the outside. Now about the current war. When Hezbollah began to act on October 8, 2023, shelling northern Israel in support of Hamas, it was an act of aggression. When they continued the shelling month after month, forcing about 60,000 Israelis to leave their homes, it became an open war that Hezbollah declared on Israel, and not the other way around. The right to self-defense includes not only responding to an attack, but also preempting a renewed threat. Is there an organization that has publicly declared the destruction of your country as its goal? For years, as they wrote, they accumulated 150,000 rockets aimed at their cities, at Israeli cities. A plan for an invasion across the border was being prepared, similar to what happened on October 70. The response to it is not aggression, but is called and actually is self-defense. Otherwise, self-defense becomes a fiction. It has a form but no substance, because the attacker always gets the first strike. The destruction of 39 villages in southern Lebanon, which has been written about so much, is neither revenge nor collective punishment. It is the elimination of the infrastructure that Hezbollah built in civilian homes. Launchers in basements, tunnels under schools, weapons depots in mosques. Any army in the world, when faced with an enemy fighting from behind the backs of civilians, is faced with a choice: to give up self-defense or to damage the infrastructure where the enemies are hiding. Israel, like any normal country, people there want to live, they want to survive, and that's why they choose the second option. This is legal according to all the rules of war, because the responsibility for mixing military and civilian lies with the one who mixed them. At the same time, Israel is creating a buffer zone, the yellow line, the green line, the red line, whatever Hezbollah's allies call it. Its purpose is simple. There must be a physical distance between Hezbollah's rockets and Israeli schools. This is not the occupation of someone else's land. It's the expansion of the security perimeter of one's own home, until the neighbor puts things in order on their side. So that's why there's a window of opportunity right now. Because the years 1925 and 1926 radically changed the map of the Middle East. Hezbollah is not what it used to be. Its leadership has been eliminated, communications compromised, and arsenals depleted. And the funding from Iran, you know how that goes. For the first time in 40 years, Lebanon's Shia community sees that the party of God is not all-powerful and is paying the price for someone else's war. Iran is even more important. The assassination of Ayatollah Khomeini, the U.S. and Israel's war against Iran's nuclear program, the seizure of an Iranian vessel in the Strait of Hormuz, and Trump's pressure. All of this is squeezing the regime like a spring. Tehran's moral and political authority has collapsed completely. For the first time since 1979, the question is being seriously discussed: what actually will happen after the regime? And it is against this backdrop that direct negotiations between Israel and Lebanon begin. For the first time in 43 years without intermediaries, without Iran, Prime Minister Salam publicly rejected Tehran's offer to speak on behalf of Lebanon. For them. That's called chutzpah, right? Without Hezbollah, which remained in the role of a satisfied observer, and without Iran, we will come to an agreement ourselves, he said. And what does President Aoun say? Either war with all its destruction or negotiations. This is the language of a normal statesman, not a propagandist. This is Lebanon returning to what it was before 1970, a country seeking its place in the region. And it doesn't want to be an instrument of someone else's war. But what if Iran becomes free? All the wars, all the terrorist organizations, all the infrastructure of destruction. Well, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, pro-Iranian militias in Syria, the destruction of Lebanon, turning Yemen into ruins. All of this was financed and directed from a single point. Remove that point and the region will come alive. Israel and Lebanon will be able to sign a full peace agreement in a matter of months. As soon as Hezbollah loses Iranian support, the Lebanese army will take control of the south, and the border between the two countries will become what it was in the 1950s and 1960s, a zone of trade, not conflict, so that Israelis can take the train and go have fun in Beirut, so that people from Beirut can go to the opera in Israel. They once had a great opera, but not anymore. Now they'll go to Tel Aviv. Israel and a free Iran would mean an entirely different civilizational map. Until 1979, Iran was one of Israel's 2 or 3 closest partners, the closest friends and allies of Israel in the Middle East. Iranians, by the way, are not Arabs. Persian culture is not historically anti-Semitic. Cyrus the Great freed the Jews from the Babylonian captivity. In Iranian history, Jews lived for thousands of years without pogroms, until the era of the Ayatollahs. The Atlantic part, especially its educated youth, is thoroughly pro-Western. If the regime falls, the new Iran will almost inevitably restore relations with Israel. This automatically renders most Palestinian terrorism meaningless, because for decades it was fueled by Iranian money. Yes, Russian money too, we all know that. But let Russia pay for both the war in Ukraine and here, so to speak, on its own. The expansion of the Abraham Accords is no longer just a hypothesis, but the next logical step. Saudi Arabia, which was already waiting for normalization before October 7, is returning to the table. The other Gulf countries are following suit. In the foreseeable future, Lebanon, Syria after the siege, even Iraq, the region's economy is transforming as if by magic. Pipelines from the Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea through Israel. That's the Abraham Corridor. Cheaper and safer than the routes through the Strait of Hormuz. Power grids, water desalination. Israelis are brilliant at this. Agriculture. They'll grow even more than in Europe, even though it's a desert there. And fish, like the Israelis raise near Beersheva in the Netivot area. They made ponds there. The biggest supplier of black caviar to Europe right now is Israel. Everything that was impossible for half a century because of the politics of destruction is becoming possible thanks to the politics of creation. That's the main conclusion. The Middle East. For the last half-century, it has been a hostage to one principle: destroy those who build. This principle was exported from Tehran and Gaza and ended up destroying the very ones who carried it as well: Lebanon, Syria, the Gaza Strip, and Iran itself. Today, for the first time in decades, there is a chance to return the region to a simple rule. Do not do to others what you do not want done to you. Israel is defending its home. That is its right. Lebanon is returning to the negotiating table. That is its chance. Iran stands on the threshold of a choice between continuing tyranny and returning to peace. That is its crossroads. If all these 3 trajectories come together, the Middle East in 57 years will not be the one we know. And Lebanon, instead of being a pawn of Tehran, will once again become what it was before the Islamists: a bridge between civilizations, not a front line. Dear friends, let's take a minute to step away from tankers, destroyers, and front lines and look at the bigger picture. What are we witnessing? We are witnessing the end of one era and the beginning of another. For 46 years since February 1979, the world has lived by rules set by terrorist regimes. They blew things up, kidnapped people, financed killers, and built nuclear programs. Meanwhile, Western diplomats discussed the complexity of the situation. What was necessary? The need for dialogue about the rights of regimes that themselves gave no rights to anyone. For 46 years, the world played a game where one side attacked and the other apologized. Well, yes, very Christian. If they strike you on one cheek, immediately turn the other cheek. This era ended before our eyes. It ended with 2 tankers in the Indian Ocean, with direct negotiations in Washington, the seizure of Iranian assets, with America's return to the sea, Lebanon's return to the negotiating table. And here's what's important to understand. This is not a geopolitical reshuffle. This is a civilizational shift. I'm not happy that wars are happening, just so you understand. None of us are happy about it, but let's be honest. Wars have raged for decades, with people dying daily in Yemen. Every day in Syria, every day in the Gaza Strip, every day in northern Israel, sirens drive children into bomb shelters. The world was not at peace. The world was in a state of slow, smoldering, never-ending slaughter, which was waged by some and paid for by others. What's happening now is not the beginning of the war. This is the end of the war. This is the beginning of the end of the war. The end of that very war that Tehran has been waging against humanity for 46 years. And this end has one remarkable quality. After it, peace is possible. I want you to imagine the year 2031 for a moment. 5 years from now. Imagine Beirut. Not ruins after Israeli strikes, but a renewed capital, once again becoming the financial center of the region. Imagine the Lebanese army actually controlling the entire territory of the country. No Hezbollah, no Iranian overseers, no state within a state. Imagine a direct Tel Aviv to Beirut flight full of tourists and businessmen. Tehran, not the capital of the Ayatollah regime, a free city. Imagine Iranian youth who no longer hide their flags, don't risk their lives for uncovered hair, and don't flee the country. Iranian entrepreneurs, engineers, scientists working in the global market, and Israeli partners coming to Isfahan on business. Imagine Saudi Arabia signing the Abraham Accords. Imagine Syria without Assad and without his successors. Imagine Iraq finally becoming Iraq and not an Iranian protectorate. Imagine the Mediterranean corridor. Pipelines, fiber optics, and railways connect India through the Gulf and Israel to Europe. This is not science fiction. This is a plan that is already being discussed in Riyadh, Jerusalem, Abu Dhabi, and of course, Washington. All of this is becoming possible for one reason. When power finally takes the side of freedom, evil retreats faster. Regimes that seemed unbreakable for 40 years crumble within a month as soon as they encounter resistance. Hezbollah, which was the most heavily armed non-state army in the world, turned into a disgruntled bystander in just 6 months. The Iranian fleet, which threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, couldn't protect even its own tanker. China, which promised Iran protection, is calling the Saudis begging for help, for Christ's sake or for Muhammad's sake. This is the main lesson of our time. Evil is strong where good is weak. When good gathers its courage and acts, evil stops being a problem much faster than we were led to believe. And finally, the most important thing, a principle that works at the state level, it also works at the individual level. Do not do to others what you would not want done to you. Build, don't destroy. Help those who build and do not help those who destroy, not even with a kind word, not even with a kind word. Even by turning away, you are helping them. If each of us lives this way, the world will become better much faster. In fact, it already is, right before our eyes. And now, the most important thing. On April 21, 2026 at sunset, Yom Ha'atzmaut began. This is the 78th Independence Day of the State of Israel. 78 years ago, a handful of Jews who survived the catastrophe were surrounded by 7 Arab armies, without allies, without weapons, without time. To prepare, they declared their own state. Back then, the world gave them 3 weeks. They survived for 78 years and became one of the strongest armies in the world. One of the most developed economies, one of the world's centers of science and technology. Today, as America returns to the sea, as Lebanon returns to the negotiating table, as Iran stands on the threshold of freedom, we celebrate Independence Day with a special feeling. Because we see everything that the founders of Israel lived, fought, and died for. It was not in vain. Happy holiday, Israel. The people of Israel live. The people of Israel live, and they will continue to live. This has been Leon Vainstein, The Science of Freedom. See you next time.